Minister, Deputy Secretary General, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, first of all, on a cold Oslo morning. It's a great honor for me, as Secretary General of the Norwegian Atlantic Committee, to welcome you to the oldest and still existing security conference in Norway, the 54th Leangkollen Conference. The same year as we mark the 70th anniversary of NATO, we are particularly proud and happy to welcome NATO's Deputy Secretary General Rose Gottemüller to Oslo. Welcome. She will speak in the first session after our foreign minister, a great and long-standing friend of the Atlantic Committee, Ine Eriksen Søreide. Welcome, heartily welcome to you. After their speeches, we will invite you all to take part in a discussion through sending in SMS questions. Please use the number under the program sheet on your seats. Just in case you lost it, the number is +47 906 64506. And I'm expecting brilliant questions from you today. And it would be very helpful also if you could write who the question is addressed to. Just write MFA or DSG. Our opening session, named Security in an Uncertain World, will continue after this first discussion on transatlantic issues with a third keynote address, given by the well-known futurist and author of Ghost Fleet, August Cole. August will introduce us to the guiding topic of the upcoming Leangkollen sessions this afternoon and tomorrow, namely technology and its interplay with geopolitics. To dig deeper into these highly timely but complicated issues, we have with us an extremely experienced group of excellent speakers and first-rate moderators. And I would like to express my gratitude to all of you for being here in Oslo with us today and tomorrow. Before I pass the word on to the chair of our board, Anne Grete Strøm Eriksen, for a more proper welcome and introduction, I will provide you with some practical and hopefully not necessary information. In case of fire or any other accident, there are 2 emergency exits here, both here in front of the room. One is over there and leads out to the terrace, where it's a lot of snow. The other here, which leads us down to the basement or ground floor. This opening session will end at 11:05 sharp, and then ask you to kindly remember all your belongings and walk out to the buses waiting in front of the Nobel Institute on the left, on this side. They will take you out to Leangkollen Conference Center where lunch and new debates are waiting for us. Please welcome our former Defense Minister, Anne Grete Strøm Eriksen. Welcome.
Minister, Deputy Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure, as Chair of the Board of the Norwegian Atlantic Committee, to welcome you all to the 54th Leangkollen Security Conference, this year titled The Future of Transatlantic Relations, Security, Policy and Technology. First, I would like to extend my congratulations to the Norwegian Atlantic Committee with its small secretariat of just 4 employees, including the Secretary General, Kate Hansen-Bundt, for composing this year's highly interesting and timely program. The Norwegian Atlantic Committee has evolved substantially since the establishment in 1955. Today, the committee is one of Norway's most important and respected arenas for discussions on foreign security and defense policy, with an emphasis on the Transatlantic Alliance. The Leangkollen Security Conference is the committee's annual flagship event, and this year the conference aims at addressing the current state and future of multilateral and transatlantic relations in light of emerging challenges such as polarization, protectionism, and nationalism. Moreover, the implications of new technology on liberal democracy and security, as well as the human and ethical consequences of the ongoing changes caused by technological advancements, will be recurring topics throughout these 2 days. NATO must be able to operate effectively in a new and constantly changing environment. Deputy Secretary General Guatemala recently stated. The second day of the conference will mainly focus on exactly this. Is NATO and other institutions, such as the EU, able to prepare for the future of modern warfare? And how will states' differences in technological advancements play into the overall global distribution of power? In order to create fruitful discussions on these highly relevant topics, the committee has invited a broad range of distinguished international and Norwegian experts. I am certain that they will enlighten and challenge us, so that when we leave the Leangkollen Conference Center tomorrow afternoon, we will all be filled with new knowledge, ideas, and wisdom that will help us understand more of our complex and changing security environment. Now, it is my great pleasure to ask our first speaker, the Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ine Eriksen Søreide, to enter the podium and officially open the 54th Leangkollen Security Conference. Please, Minister, the floor is yours.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, Rose, Anne-Grete, Kate. This is the 54th Leangkollen Conference, and somehow I feel that I've been here for the past 50 of them, more or less. That's maybe not completely accurate, but it feels like it. And that is because this has become an institution. And it's exactly right, as both Kate and Anne-Grete mentioned, that this is actually the place to be when February starts and security policy is on the agenda. I think we have discussed several times before in this forum that international law is our first line of defense. But how effective would that line of defense be without the institutions and the practices that make up our security architectures? Institutions such as NATO, the EU, the OSCE, the Council of Europe. Last year, we commemorated the end of World War I, a war of immense and unspeakable human suffering. Interestingly, though, the period before the war began was a rich era in European history, an era that even bears some resemblance to our world today. A period when, at least for a long time, economic liberalism thrived. A period of growth and innovation, a period of technological breakthroughs that connected the world in new ways, a period of advances in international law, and last but not least, a period when alliances was formed. But the security architecture of 1914 was also marred by weaknesses and ambiguities that amplified distrust, fueled escalation, and led to war. The experiences from this era and the interwar period provide a useful vantage point for the topic that we are to discuss today. They remind us how subtle the differences between success and disaster can be, and how finely tuned our security architecture must be in order to be both effective and sustainable. The system we've built in Europe since 1945 is unique in that sense, a system that is built on the ruins of two devastating world wars. It certainly has ensured security and stability, but in contrast to other ways of organizing international relations, it has also produced prosperity, liberty, and democracy. And it has given small states a say in international affairs that they rarely have had in European history. So when our security architecture is under pressure, much more is at stake than security and stability alone. And when we address these challenges, the devil is in the details. Moral arguments are not enough. We have to come up with concrete solutions, both abroad and at home. Transatlantic relations is at the heart of this conference. A strong transatlantic bond is essential to our security architecture. It's one of the main factors that separates the current order from previous failures. Yes, the US certainly also engaged in Europe before 1945, but temporarily and mostly to solve and deal with crisis. The long-term effort that started in 1945 and endures to this day has been crucial in making Europe pull in the same direction, in ensuring the participation of other great powers, and in creating a level playing field. Another critical factor very much linked to US leadership has been our ability to adapt. Historically, changes in the European security architecture have followed in the wake of war. The current architecture, however, has to a great extent also evolved in peacetime, in response to specific challenges that arose in the 20th century, such as the risk of Soviet aggression, or nuclear attacks and proliferation, and of uncontrolled armament, or the risks posed by new technology, by misunderstanding, as well as emerging new threats such as terrorism. Last but not least, the architecture has also evolved as a result of positive aspirations. Our aspirations to build trust and confidence, to reconcile countries, and to manage and prevent conflicts. And to build a democratic Europe, whole, free, and at peace, to use the word of the late President Bush. It would not have been possible without the visionary generation of Europeans, including the likes of Schuman, Monnet, and Adenauer, who saw the potential of European integration as a means of building peace in Europe. The result is an architecture that strikes a delicate balance between different and sometimes opposing concerns, between defense and deterrence on the one hand, and confidence building on the other hand, between idealism and realism, between a Europe of nations and a Europe of great powers, between institutional approaches and bilateral solutions. So what are the main challenges to security architecture in Europe today? I see at least 5 challenges that distinguish the current era from previous periods. I think, could I have a little bit glass of water? Because I think my throat is getting... And I'm only getting started, so you can just imagine. Thank you. So, the first challenge is uncertainty about future US leadership in Europe and great power participation. I want to start out by saying that on many scores, the record is very positive. The US has strengthened its presence in Europe, spearheaded important reforms in NATO, and mobilized allies to spend more on defense. We are seeing a US that is committed to the full spectrum of allied missions and operations. A US that last year, during the Trident Juncture exercise here in Norway, participated with more personnel and equipment than it has done for years. And I see and I experience a remarkable continuity in the practical security policy, despite what you would think if you only read Twitter feeds. However, we're also seeing a US that questions international cooperation on a more fundamental level. A US that has pulled out of certain international institutions and agreements, that occasionally questions key institutions and alliances, and that increasingly treats international relations and at times even strategic matters in transactional terms. Such developments are a source of concern. On a theoretical level, one can entertain ideas of other ways of organizing European security, including visions of strategic autonomy, a European army, or a Nordic defense union. For that matter, such ideas have been around since the 50s. The fact of the matter, though, is that no country and no arrangement can replace the US in Europe. US military power is unparalleled, and in addition, no other country has the same political determination and power to make countries rally around common values and pull in the same direction. The US fostered the European security architecture, and for better or worse, it remains vital in upholding it. But we also need to keep other powers engaged, including Russia. Russia's violation of international law and the shrinking democratic space inside Russia are serious reasons for concern. And short-term gains from pulling out of structured international cooperation have always been a temptation for great powers. In the long term, however, a Europe without a strong NATO, OSCE, and a Council of Europe is hardly a good place for anyone. For small countries like Norway, we would see our security and our role in the world diminished. For the US, it would potentially mean having to deal with new crises in Europe. For Russia, it would possibly mean having to deal with an arms race that would surpass its means. Indeed, the lessons of 2 world wars and the interwar period is that we need strong institutions, and that they are only strong if we manage to keep the powers on board. The League of Nations did not fail because of insufficient regulation or faltering ideas. It failed primarily because of lack of great power commitment. If great powers are not on board, our efforts will be at best ineffective, at worst counterproductive. My second concern is the scale and extent of challenges to the security architecture. Our architecture has always evolved in response to the security climate. Even in difficult periods, we've been able to move forward, at least in some areas. Today, though, we seem to have challenges in several areas, and they come at the same time. In terms of international law, with Russia's annexation of Crimea and the ongoing war in Ukraine. In terms of basic principles, with Russia's emphasis on the old-fashioned concept of spheres of influence, a concept reminiscent of the security architectures of the 19th century. Perhaps stable under certain conditions, but in most cases at the expense of liberty, prosperity, and sovereignty. Furthermore, we barely have a functional conventional arms regime. The INF Treaty is failing due to repeated Russian violations. The future of New START may seem uncertain, and the Vienna document is undermined by creative ways of staging and counting exercises, and I could go on. NATO is materially stronger than before, but the internal cohesion is under pressure, and the issue of burden sharing is one of several challenges that can drive us further apart if we do not resolve them in time. My third concern is the pace of technological changes. The erosion of our security architecture happens in a period that has been labeled the Fourth Industrial Revolution, a time with tremendous advances in cyber capabilities, artificial intelligence, missile technology, autonomous weapons, and such developments may lead to changes in power distribution. And they have already affected the way many countries are thinking about defense and deterrence. Our security architecture has always been able to respond to such challenges. Today, however, we are caught up in an effort to save existing structures, and that leaves little room for foresight and for addressing new strategic challenges. My fourth concern is growing fragmentation. In recent years, we've seen an impressive development of defense cooperation in smaller groups. The combination of financial constraints and growing security needs have drawn us all together in new ways. In principle, this is a positive development, and Norway supports it and has taken part and is taking part in several initiatives. Not only does it, at best, save money, it creates a solidarity that not only relies on treaty obligations or common values, it creates a level of integration of military value chains that make collective defense unavoidable in the event of an attack. However, all of this requires a strong alliance. Under a more fragmented security order, interdependence can produce very different results. In fact, conflicts can escalate in new and unpredictable ways. In 1914, complex military and political affiliations contributed to setting Europe ablaze, although the initial spark happened in a small country on the outskirts of Europe. My fifth concern is the growing pressure on democracy itself. The success of our alliance has not only been its ability to provide peace and stability, but also liberty, prosperity, and democracy. All these factors are interlinked and mutually sustaining. Freedom in Europe would not have survived the 50s and the 60s without the protection of the US. The EU could not have developed without NATO. NATO would not have flourished without the prosperity brought by European integration. And our democratic aspirations would not have been successful and not have been as successful as they have been without institutions such as the Council of Europe. Today, the very type of cooperation that brought forth these institutions is under pressure, not only by flawed democracies, but even some in NATO and EU member states. So how do we preserve the security architecture in the face of such immense challenges? I would, of course, not leave you with 5 challenges and no solutions, so I am going to offer 3 suggestions for the way forward. First, we need to keep all the great powers in, and above all, the US. The US is the best bulwark against fragmentation and multipolarity in Europe, and it remains the sole guarantor of a level Russian-European playing field. Keeping all member states in requires something that I discussed at length last year when we met for this conference, namely allied patience. We may not agree on all issues, but we have to work together to mobilize the same sort of pragmatism that made the alliance navigate through difficult waters in the past. Moral indignation dominates much of the public discourse between Europe and the US these days. Focusing on concrete results is often a more constructive path forward. A strong and stable Europe is also very much in the self-interest of the US. Europe is the largest export market for the US. A stable, friendly Europe allows the US to engage more in other regions, such as the Asia-Pacific region. A stable Europe has institutions and agreements that stand in the way of an arms race that would be vastly more expensive in the current climate of technological change than in previous periods. Avoiding an arms race is not only in the US interest, it's also in Russia's interests. The economic burden of the Cold War arms race were among the factors that brought down the Soviet Union. And indeed, military spending has bearing on other public services like pensions, like social security, infrastructure, and development. And last year's discussions on pensions reform in Russia was a stark reminder of how sensitive these issues are also with the Russian public. Second, we have to meet the challenges with reform and with engagement. That has always been part of our answer. We do not dispose of our architecture, we keep it and we reform it. Our institutions are only as strong as we make them. And that is why reform will be high on our agenda if we are elected a non-permanent seat to the Security Council. And that is also why the government is right now preparing a white paper on reforming and upholding the multilateral system and cooperation. Norway has often been at the forefront of reforms in NATO. From the 60s, when we made the case for strengthening NATO's civilian profile, and up to recent years, when we have called for reforms of the command structure to better deal with challenges in NATO's core areas. The reforms since Wales, including the latest establishment of a maritime and logistics command, are important steps in ensuring that NATO remains fit for purpose. These reforms has in part both been initiated by and driven by Norway. But the single most important deliverable to keep the US engaged in the short term is burden sharing. And burden sharing, my friends, is not a minor issue. Meeting the targets will take time, but Allied patience has to be a two-way street in this area as well. While we've not reached the objectives yet, years of cuts have been turned into solid growth. Today, all NATO members are beefing up their budgets. Indeed, between 2015 and 2017, the combined increases in Allied spending amounted to almost the size of the whole military budget of Russia. Norway has increased its defense spending by 30% in real terms since 2013. We are well above the 20% investment pledge, currently at about 27% and increasing. With the next long-term defense plan, the aim is to move even further towards the 2% target. In the face of pressure against NATO, we are not abandoning the ship by nationalizing our capabilities. We are investing even more in capabilities that will strengthen the alliance as a whole. That is high-end strategic capabilities that are deployable and interoperable, such as submarines, F-35s, P-8s, intel capabilities, and army assets, just to mention a few. We follow the same approach in other areas. In a challenging time for Europe, we are continuing to meet our political and financial obligations in the OSCE and in the Council of Europe. Both these organizations are highly challenged at the current political developments. Norwegian financial contributions to the OSCE and its institutions have increased significantly over the last couple of years, with an aim to strengthen the OSCE's impact in terms of conflict prevention and capacity building, especially democratization in the East. And third, we have to bilateralize in a wise manner. Cooperation in groups of 2 or more countries can strengthen the security architecture in Europe, but it can also weaken it. A complex web of formats like the one we have in Europe today is only viable if it builds on strong transatlantic bonds. At the beginning of my presentation, I said that if you leave the US out of the European equation, you are left with a Europe without sufficient collective defense. Likewise, if you leave NATO out of the equation, you are left with a fragmented Europe. In a time of scarce resources, transatlantic friction, and the emergence of new defense initiatives, we should not underestimate the risk of fragmentation. We have to make sure that whatever we do in other settings, be it NORDEFCO, PESCO, EDF, European Intervention Initiative, it does not undermine but strengthen NATO. Duplication and uncertainty is not the way forward. Norway will continue to engage with the European Union and cooperation in Europe. We intend to take part in the European Intervention Initiative. We're also assessing whether and how Norway can take part in new EU initiatives such as the European Defence Fund and PESCO. We do it because we believe it can reinforce the existing European security architecture, not undermine it. We do not believe in a new security architecture. We believe in a reformed one. Finally, dear friends, in exactly 60 days, on the 4th of April, I will be in Washington, D.C., and together with other foreign ministers of the Alliance, we will celebrate the 70th-year anniversary of the organization. And in 55 days, the UK is scheduled to leave the EU, so 2 different things there. In 1949, the founding members of NATO promised not only to defend each other, but also to defend the values that we share. Our alliance has stood the test of time because we have been able to adapt to new challenges. Our alliance has stood the test of time because each of us has built societies that value and uphold the solidarity and shared responsibility that this alliance was founded on. And our alliance has stood the test of time because the bonds that bind us together are strong. We have seen challenging times before, and we have overcome those challenges. I'm equally sure that we will overcome the challenges that we see currently. Thank you.
Irina, thank you for this sobering and thoughtful way to kick off our conference and your optimism. We will certainly continue to discuss many of these points you have made, particularly on the future of a rule-based, liberal, multilateral world order throughout this afternoon and tomorrow at Leangkollen. I will now turn to our next speaker, who represents one of the main pillars of the multilateral system created after World War II, namely NATO. Let me introduce NATO's Deputy Secretary General Rose Gottemöller. Rose has held this position since 2016, but has a long career as a very senior position inside and outside the US government, where she was intimately involved in debating many of the issues that we already have touched upon, especially with regard to arms control, nuclear weapons, Soviet and Russian security, and other strategic topics. You can read more about her impressive background in the conference program. Please, Rose, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I must say, it's a rare pleasure to be the fourth woman to take the stage today, especially in our security field. So I wanted to begin with a big thank you to you, Ina, to Anne-Greta and Kate for flying the flag of security so strongly and for setting such a good example for me as I speak to you this morning. The Norwegian Atlantic Committee has clearly been driving the discussion on transatlantic security here in Norway for over 60 years, and the need for strong and informed debate has perhaps never been as important as it is today, and I think Ina's speech for us this morning really underscored the important issues and challenges, so thank you for so clearly outlining the challenges that confront us. I know that the Secretary General was very happy to join you here last year for the first time, and he asked me to say a big hei og beste ønsker to you this morning. I hope you will forgive me for continuing in English, but despite having worked closely with Jens for 2 years now, a wonderful 2 years, I may add, my Norwegian is otherwise non-existent, so I will continue in English. I am just as honored to be with you today in the Norwegian Nobel Institute, as Jens was last year, which is a fitting backdrop for our discussions. For more than a century, the Nobel Peace Prize has celebrated efforts to promote peaceful solutions between nations, and this is the very spirit in which NATO was created 70 years ago. From 1949 to 1989, NATO's mandate and field of operations were focused on keeping the peace in Europe. But since the end of the Cold War, the scale, scope, and location of our activities has grown well beyond what our founders might have imagined. The world in which we are now living is more complex, connected, and contested, and the economic and geopolitical shifts we're experiencing are bringing greater challenges and opportunities. This is blurring the lines between peace and conflict. A more assertive Russia to the east of the alliance continues to disregard international law and uses force against its neighbors. Ongoing conflict and fragility to the south is driving immigration and violent extremism. And rising economic and military powers, including China, are increasingly asserting their influence on the global stage. Across all of our societies, we are seeing challenges to the political establishment and a rise in the many isms that are highlighted in the introduction to this session. We also see the dizzying pace of technological change in both civilian and military fields. Again, I welcome the more detailed treatment of all of these challenges that we just now heard from the foreign minister. I know that when SecGen Stoltenberg spoke here last year, he talked about visiting the battlefields of Northern Europe and seeing for himself how technology can vastly increase the scale of death and devastation. Technology has always inspired fear and awe, and not always in equal measure. From the moment our ancestors first made fire, through the steam engine and the first industrial revolution, to today's fourth industrial revolution with artificial intelligence and 3D printing. I often tell a tale. I tell the tale of a young girl captured by the promise of technology who was growing up in Columbus, Ohio in the 1950s. One evening, her father took her into their front yard to point out a tiny dot of light that was traveling across the sky. That year was 1957, and that little girl was me. That speck of light was Sputnik, the first unmanned satellite in space, which was launched by the Soviet Union. For many Americans and Europeans, those were scary times, with fears turning on the march of technology and the very real risk of a Cold War turning hot. But, my father saw the world a little differently. He saw the Sputnik launch as an exciting new development, pushing the boundaries of science and technology, offering opportunities for cooperation. I was infected by my father's enthusiasm and have been driven ever since by a fascination with science and technology and the real opportunities it offers us for cooperation and what we can do when we put our heads together. We can really achieve a lot. International science and technology cooperation has shown us that again and again and again. NATO and all our allies, including Norway, are taking a similar approach to today's big questions. How do we navigate a more uncertain world? How do we turn challenges into opportunities? And how can we work together to make technology work for us and not against us, both now and in the future? I know you will confront these issues in your discussions over the next 2 days, and I very much welcome both the discussion and look forward to your results. For me, 2 things are fundamental to our success in answering this question. The first is our unity, and our unity in the NATO alliance. And the second is our ability to adapt. Again, thank you, Ina, so much for introducing both of these issues this morning. I think we make a great pair here on the podium to launch the discussions. I'm sure you will have heard questions lately about the strength of the transatlantic unity. NATO is an alliance of 29 with very different democracies, with different cultures and histories, different geographies, and different points of view. And by the way, I want to underscore the happy news today that we hope soon to be 30 allies, with the Republic of North Macedonia joining our alliance after all accession procedures are completed. And we are planning to sign the accession protocol this week, which can then start the ratification process in Greece, in Skopje, and across the alliance altogether. It is precisely diversity and debate in the alliance that make us stronger. I trust that you've all heard the saying that 2 heads are better than 1. Well, imagine how much stronger we are when we put our 29 heads together, not to mention our resources, capabilities, and expertise. There isn't a single issue, from deterring a potential conventional attack to protecting our networks in the cyber domain, from tackling terrorism to keeping pace with rapid technological advances. For today's complex challenges, there is rarely a single or simple solution. Rather, it requires all tools to be put together in our toolkits, and all countries, large and small, have something meaningful to bring to the table. NATO has benefited tremendously, for example, from the Secretary General's experience of handling relations with Russia while he was the Prime Minister of Norway. In turn, he says, this was possible because of the strength and the stability that NATO provides. He was also quite clear, however, during his visit to Oslo last month, that Norway is the only NATO country today bordering Russia that does not spend 2% of its GDP on defense and does not yet have a credible plan to get there. To navigate in today's increasingly uncertain security environment, we expect all allies, Norway included, to invest in our collective defense in terms of cash, capabilities, and contributions. Throughout the years, NATO has demonstrated that when it comes to addressing common challenges and defending our shared interests, we stand united, and that ultimately we come together around our core commitment to protect and defend one another. From this solid foundation, NATO has been able to change and adapt as the world around us changes. This is our other great source of strength. From 2014, we have implemented the most significant reinforcement of our collective defense since the Cold War. At the Brussels summit last July, NATO leaders took over 100 decisions to modernize our alliance, boost the readiness of our forces, increase defense spending, and strengthen our capabilities across all domains: land, sea, air, and importantly, cyber. We proved our ability to respond to any threat from any direction through our Trident Juncture exercise here in Norway at the end of last year. And by the way, I was very impressed. I had an opportunity to participate in the Distinguished Visitors Day, and I wanted to say I was impressed, of course, with the exercise itself and seeing all the allies working together, but I was really impressed with host nation Norway and what you did to support that exercise. So thank you very much for that on behalf of all the allies. It was our largest exercise since the end of the Cold War, bringing together over 50,000 participants from 31 countries, all of our members, as well as Sweden and Finland. I wanted to mention, actually, my paragraph now talks about NATO's warm welcome, hospitality, and et cetera. I extemporized a moment ago, but I did want to recount a great story that, Ina, you mentioned at our December ministerial. I hope you won't mind that I bring it up in this setting. That the warmth of the Norwegian welcome was very literal in some places, with some Norwegians even knitting socks for the troops who came from the southern part of the alliance, not quite ready for the Norwegian winter already setting in November. So we were very grateful in any number of ways for the support that Norway offered. As we adapt to the physical environment, as well as the changing security environment, we are also adapting when it comes to dealing with the vast spectrum of challenges that new technologies can present, from electoral interference and misinformation to attacks on critical infrastructure and the use of drones. We often call these hybrid threats. We are building up our resilience and our capacity to respond to hybrid and cyber attacks by improving our capabilities and sharing more information and best practices. We have specific points of contact in all 29 countries, and we have cyber defense cooperation with more than 40 other countries and international organizations, including the European Union. Our Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Estonia has grown from strength to strength, and our Rapid Reaction Cyber Defense Team is on standby 24/7 to help allies under attack. We have been crystal clear that a cyber attack could constitute an attack on our collective security and trigger an Article 5 response. At the same time, we're working to harness the potential of new technologies and remain at the cutting edge of innovation. All allies committed in 2014 to spending 2% of their GDP on defense by 2024, and to allocate at least 20% of total defense spending to new capabilities, research, and development. And indeed, Norway does fulfill that goal by already standing at 27%. Last year, we adopted a new science and technology strategy, and we continue to build relationships with the private sector through our NATO Industry Forum, which I see as one of the most important ways that we can build up our capability to innovate in this challenging period. This kind of cooperation can yield very practical applications, from enhancing digital underwater communications to improving medical and human performance in cold weather conditions and locating survivors in natural disasters. Again, I was thrilled to see this in practice at a field demonstration close to Trondheim during Trident Juncture. We saw how remote and unmanned technology could be used to defend the base and detect threats more effectively and more safely. This included thermal imaging, shot and movement sensors, and Black Hornet, the world's smallest surveillance drone. We also saw a cutting-edge 3D printing facility used to provide spare parts in real time to forces in the field. All of these innovations show great promise for saving resources and saving, most importantly, lives. So I think the direction of technology and the direction technology drives us must always bear in mind those particular goals. So in this challenging and changing context, NATO continues to adapt. And as we celebrate 7 decades of our alliance this year, April 4th, 60 days from now, allies are doing more together and stepping up their efforts, including on fairer burden sharing. In sum, if you want to know how I think we can best navigate this more uncertain world, we need to continue to stick together, first and foremost. Second, we need to continue to invest in our collective security to ensure that we are ready to rise to any challenge from any direction. And finally, to hark back to the old days in my front yard in Columbus, Ohio, we need to see the opportunities in some of the new challenges that we face. So with that, colleagues and friends, thank you very much once again for this opportunity to join you in Oslo today. It's an enormous honor to be here with you in this beautiful building and to recollect the proud heritage of the Nobel Peace Prize. So thank you so very much for this opportunity, and I look forward to our discussion.
So, thank you very much, Rose. I would like you to take a place on the podium, and maybe we can discuss a little bit and answer some questions. Please find a chair over there, and Foreign Minister. And I hope you are now ready to send me some SMS questions. I need to have my cell phone then to read them. But I think I would like to kick off with some questions before I read my on my phone. I think that we have to speak about the INF Treaty. You being an arms control expert and been involved in this during most of your career, do you foresee a new arms race in Europe? What does this agreement mean, both for European security and the United States?
Well, first and foremost, many of you know that I've been working on this issue since the Obama administration. The Trump administration has been very clear in underscoring the amount of diplomacy that the United States has applied to trying to get the Russians to deal with this violation of the INF Treaty. So I've been working the issue since May of 2013, a long, long time. And in all that time, the Russians have been unwilling to work with us seriously to confront this issue. And so I have personally been very concerned that the Russians are hollowing out the INF Treaty from inside. And so it's very important to recollect that a treaty that is only being respected by one party is no longer providing for security. And that is a message that the allies have truly understood. We've been very grateful at the way they have understood and comprehended the challenge that this Russian action faces or imposes on the international system. But that said, I don't see the necessity of an arms race by any means. For one thing, this new Russian capability is one of a number of capabilities. They are modernizing their forces. We need to keep a sharp eye on that. We need to be very, very astute in reckoning what we require for our own deterrence and defense. But I'm sure will do so in a judicious manner because, frankly, allies have a lot that they need to spend their resources on. They're very, I would say, precious defense resources, and it's not on an arms race involving intermediate-range missiles. And for Russia, Ina already mentioned the extent to which they are overstretched in their defense establishment as well. It was interesting over the weekend to take note that President Putin went on record saying that he was very keen any so-called response to U.S. violations should be taken out of the existing defense budget, that there would be no new resources. I think, frankly, they've already budgeted for all this stuff. So anyway, he talked about a couple systems in addition to the 9M729, the Caliber, for example, the naval missile. But to my mind, they've already budgeted for what they're going to do with that program. I will be glad to discuss this issue further as per the interest of of those in the audience, but I really wanted to stress at the outset that I do not see that we are on the cusp of a new arms race here.
And many analysts have also argued that it has outlived itself because it's just about Russia and the United States. It's a relic somehow from the Cold War, the treaty, particularly when we think about China and other nuclear powers. Do you see in the future any possibility that you can get a broader group of countries into something similar as this treaty?
Yes, Ina spoke earlier about the necessity for strategic patience among the allies, and I see the necessity also for strategic patience as we confront the future of constraints and restraint involving intermediate-range ground-launched systems. The strategic stability fact remains that these systems are highly accurate and they are fast flyers. And so they pose the same problem that they posed in the 1980s. Fast flight time to target, giving little warning to the country under attack. And so the threat of what we call a decapitating first strike emanating from these systems is serious, and it remains serious. But it remains serious for all countries who are deploying these systems, and if there is a proliferation, and there has been a proliferation across Eurasia, you mentioned China, also the South Asian countries, DPRK. Iran just announced over this weekend that it was deploying a new intermediate range system. So all must confront the threat that these kinds of missiles pose. This is a strategic stability issue, and so frankly, I welcome a phase of serious stability discussions now among all interested parties, with the notion that over time there will be a recognition of the importance of some form of restraint with regard to these systems. So I am not at all pessimistic about the future, but I do think it will require patience, it will require time, and it will require engagement to have some really meaty discussion on what the implications of these systems are for all countries involved.
Thank you. Foreign Minister.
Well, there's really not much to add when Rose has spoken about this, because I think she's one of the people in the world who knows most about the INF Treaty and arms control regimes. But I just want to add just a couple of points, and that is that I got asked several times during the last week about exactly what Rose is pointing to. Will we now see a new arms race? And I fully agree with Rose that I don't think we will. And one of the reasons for that is that the INF Treaty is, even though important, it's only one piece in a bigger puzzle when it comes to arms control. Having said that, the arms control regime as such is also under pressure. And one of my concerns now is what will happen with the New START Treaty when it expires in 2021. Will it be prolonged for 5 years, as we all hope, or will it not? So I think that we should use this, I would say, the impasse that has happened to also have a good discussion about the arms control regime as such. Mm-hmm. We need to make sure that we have agreements. We need to make sure that we do not pull out of everything, even though the INF Treaty now seems to be coming to an end. 6 months will pass, and in those 6 months, both Russia and the US will have to act as if the treaty was still valid. They do not have the opportunity to do things that are in violation of the treaty. But of course, what we have seen over the past years is repeatedly that the Russians have not complied with the treaty. And over time, I mean, I think it's very regrettable that the treaty now seems to end. But over time, you cannot uphold a treaty between two parties where only the one party upholds it. And ever since 2014, the US has kept NATO allies informed about Russian breaches of the treaty. So this is nothing new, and I think that the diplomatic efforts that has been done by the US in these years has really been commendable, but unfortunately, it hasn't helped.
Ina, being a former defense minister and a foreign minister, I have to ask you the 2% question. Rose said that Norway is the only country bordering Russia that not use 2% of GDP to defense. And you said that burden sharing is the most important way to keep US commitments to Europe. Will Norway deliver in 2025?
Well, as I said, burden sharing is actually one of the cornerstones in the discussions that we're having in the alliance now. And it's not, and I think this is important to underline, this is not about Donald Trump, because these discussions started long before him. Yeah. I've been hearing these discussions for as long as I've been engaged in security and defense policies, as long as I've been going to the US, having meetings with senators and representatives. This has been on the agenda for a very long time, and it is needed, because defense spending, we're going in the wrong direction between all allies. And I think that it's about time that we have a good discussion on this, and that we have goals and targets that we adhere to. And as every other country, we also do. We have increased our defense spending substantially, and in my opinion, it has been absolutely necessary, because we were at a place where defense spending was not taken seriously enough, because we had, of course, also other things that needed to be dealt with. But given the state of insecurity around us and our security policy neighborhood, it was really necessary to do. And that is why we've been pushing upwards and will continue to do so. Having said that, I think it is also extremely important that this burden-sharing discussion is not only about a 2% target. It is about covering the needs of NATO, covering the needs of the individual country. And when we talk about this in a NATO context, I think most countries agree to this. And the reason I mention that is, from our perspective, when we invest, as I mentioned, in high-end capabilities, they are both deployable and interoperable. We're not only doing it for ourselves. We are doing it to strengthen the alliance, but we're also doing it to make sure that we have a stronger armed forces and defense in Norway. So I think that from the angle of the individual country, from the angle of NATO, it is important that we're not reducing this only to a discussion of a percent target, but also a discussion of how we spend money and why we do it, because we have to uphold this. We can't come to 2025 and then suddenly everyone loses the interest or the momentum. We have to keep going, because we're making investments now that will demand a lot of money to uphold and to run. I mean, when we invest in new F-35s, we can't ground them in 2025. We have to keep the budgets going so that we can fly them. As one example.
And then comes new technology. We don't know how the world looks in 2024, 2025. Rose, you mentioned the story with your father seeing Sputnik on the sky in 58, I guess. 57, yeah. How do you see the challenge, the interplay between technology and geopolitics when it comes to the relation between states in the international system, but also technology kicking into our political systems, making democracy more vulnerable because we have different ways of communicating. The political dialogue is not longer just among party members. It's, on Facebook, social media. I would like you to reflect a bit on the interplay between technology, geopolitics, and internal politics, please.
Clearly, you will have 2 days to wrestle with this question, but I will do my best. I will give you some of my opinion on this matter. And the first thing I do want to underscore is a point that I made in my address. Let's not only focus on the challenges, but also on the opportunities. I frequently get asked, for example, it's the question about a new Cold War, question about a new Cuban Missile Crisis. And I say, look at the differences in communications between the early 60s and today. Today, okay, you may think it's a bad thing that leaders can text each other or that, national security advisors can text each other, but I like to use that as an example of where we have so many more lines of communication open and so many more layers. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the White House they had to fall back on the excellent Soviet ambassador at that time, Dobrynin, of course, but also they had to seek out the task correspondent in Washington because they were trying to get some messages through to the Kremlin, and they didn't have any other way that they could figure out to go about it. Now, of course, that led to the famous hotline, but that itself was a technological innovation and provided an opportunity for furthering peace, security, predictability, and in the end of the day, mutual understanding between Moscow and Washington. So I like to use that as an example. One of the issues, though, we have to confront, I think, in thinking through this is now it's essentially a free-for-all. It's an unregulated kind of communication. It's not only President Trump who likes to tweet things publicly, but I've noticed there's quite a bit of that going on around the European Union these days and between London and Brussels. So, you know, it's all over the world. It's a reality, the situation today. But how do we think about policy making when there is more of a free-for-all in the debate and discussion between and among policymakers? I haven't been able, I think, to sort through these issues adequately myself, but I do think it requires a degree of experience and deftness in considering when to make use of more public means of communication and when to keep it quiet. I think from time immemorial, leaders have communicated through the media, through the press. So let's just think about, you know, what makes sense for achieving pragmatic and practical goals. So that's one example, and I'll leave you with it, that I think we need to consider the challenges, yes, but also look to the opportunities, but then also think about, I don't want to say regulation, because people think, you just want to put in new rules, you know, that will entirely constrain. No, I think thinking about some ways to introduce predictability into how these tools are used, and also to ensure that the rule of law is upheld, the rights of individuals, for example, the rights to privacy are upheld. How do we essentially weave that in without placing undue constraints? So those are some of the thoughts I would have as you embark on your debates in the next 2 days.
Thank you.
And then not to be on the pessimistic side, but I would add one challenge that I think could be interesting to discuss. One of the things that we see is right now the combination of, as Rose says, the free-for-all. Everyone can put information out, anyone can relate to that information in however way they want to. The challenge is that it happens simultaneously as we see an erosion of trust in institutions, which means that what a government says is no longer necessarily something that people believes in. That also opens up a whole new space for misinformation that is very often deliberately put out there. And the reason it is done that way is very often to cast doubt into decision-making processes. And we can use NATO as an example. What constitutes an Article 5 situation? Are we below or over the threshold of an Article 5 situation? It can, in some instances, be very, very difficult to decide. And to make the most of the insecurity in such a discussion, that will also have to happen very fast. You could easily see that those actors, those adversaries, who would like to, in a way, alter the course of history with very simple, often free means, can do that without taking a lot of either political or military risk. And I think it's something that is worth reflecting on and thinking about when we discuss things in NATO, but also more generally, because the use of hybrid means is absolutely nothing new. It's been used in all wars and all societies ever since the beginning of time, but it takes a bit of a new shape right now. The new and interesting part, however, is that usually it was used for the means of the inferior part in a potential conflict because they had no other means. Now it is often also used by the superior part in a conflict. And that is something that, in a way, changes a bit of the equation here. It makes it more difficult to make sure that the information that gets out is the correct one, that people have trust in institutions and their way of, conveying a truth. And as long as even truths are portrayed as fake, and fake news, it's increasingly difficult.
Dangerous.
It is difficult indeed. I've got a lot of SMS questions now. I think I will turn to give the audience a chance to get answers to their questions. One here goes maybe for both of you. NATO is said to be an alliance of values, not just security. Today, with increased polarization, what are the core values shared by the allies? And both of you, I think, touch a little bit upon it in your speeches, that it's different kind of democracies, I think you said, Rose, that are in this alliance. And we have, of course, some allied countries developing maybe in a more pessimistic way when it comes to respecting rule of law and democratic rights as freedom of speech. What are the core values that we share?
That's an easy one. That's an easy one from my perspective, because the core values are inscribed in the Washington Treaty, which we will be celebrating on the 4th of April, 70 years to the day from when it was first signed. So the core values are clear and succinct. They are spelled out in the treaty. If you haven't read it lately, I commend it to you. Unlike things like the New START Treaty, which were over 400 pages long, the Washington Treaty is just a couple pages long, and it's well worth reading because it does focus on the core values as well as the basic organization of the alliance, and particularly built around Article 5, our famous all for one and one for all article. Now, lots of questions have been raised recently about the different directions that democracies are taking here in Europe. I want to stress that inside the NATO institution, on a day-in, day-out basis, all of those values are brought to play again and again in how we organize our work. So even if capitals are engaged in particular direction or particular debate, NATO itself is unrelenting about advancing those values every day in, again, how we organize an exercise like Trident Juncture, thinking about the interests of local communities and how they interact with our troops on the ground, thinking about the rights of civilians in some of our other missions in Afghanistan, and how we plan, how we organize, and how we carry out our day-to-day business. So it's not perhaps a perfect answer in terms of how we interact with capitals, because capitals have their own political dynamics at work. But I am confident that from the perspective of the NATO institution, we drive the message about the necessity of upholding those core values day in, day out with each and every NATO ally. So I am very confident about that, and we hope that they have a beneficial influence on a day-in, day-out basis as well for the countries involved.
And I think it's interesting to see what happened during the NATO summit last year. It was, of course, some turbulence on the outside, but the fact of the matter is that was maybe the most productive and the most substantial NATO summit for the past 25 years. The decisions that were made, and Rose alluded to the around 100 different decisions that were made, actually pushing the alliance in a very good direction, undertaking reforms that we haven't seen for many, many years taking place in NATO. We could never have done that had it not been for those values that were, after all, were kind of pulling us together. And of course, we can discuss how things are portrayed, how people talk, and so forth. But as I said last year, and I really very often use that as an example, we would not have been willing to risk the lives of our soldiers if it wasn't for the fact that we were defending something that was bigger than ourselves. We are moving beyond our immediate self-interest. That's what alliances are about. That's why we sacrifice. We wouldn't have done that if this was only a random scramble of countries doing something together to save money. It's so much more than that, and that has been upheld for 70 years, and I see that being really as strong now as it was.
Thank you. I have another one here. May we expect a competition among NATO allies to strengthen bilateral ties to the US if the US disengages from the alliance?
Well, first, I don't think the US will disengage from the alliance. I think that's I think that's a very important premise to make. But having said that, we have always been doing this along two tracks. We are contributing solidly into NATO when it comes to everything from funding to reform. But we've also, as long as I think our countries have existed, we've been also fostering a very strong bilateral tie to the US, as do every other country. And if anything, what I am experiencing over the past years is that tie, those ties have been even stronger. The engagement from the US side in everything from our assessments of Russia to taking part with the Marines training and exercising here is very strong, and that is something that we appreciate strongly, and we don't take the US for granted in any way. At the same time, we started in the beginning of 2014 to set out a course, and that was, and I underline again, before Trump, but we set out the course to strengthen our bilateral ties also with certain European countries, like Germany, like France, like the UK, and that will continue also after Brexit, I have to say, very importantly, and the Netherlands, as four examples, because we have a lot in common with these countries, and we see that we also operate a lot together, which means that we have a potential for doing more together, not at the expense of the alliance at all, but I think it has contributed to strengthening also the alliance and initiatives that we've been taking. But I would also, in closing, as I did at the outset, argue the premise that the US is leaving the alliance.
I can but agree, and I don't have anything to add to Ina's comments.
Yeah. But still we see a US president that has somehow invented a new concept of transactionalism, who wants to engage bilateral with different allies and countries, also inside the European Union, both on trade but also on security. Is this just his rather unconventional style, or is it more structural, what we are seeing in the changes of dealing with the European allies?
Well, I'll say that it's important to look at different actors in the American system, and clearly President Trump has a unique style. We see it from NATO headquarters as having been very, very valuable in pushing certain messages, including on burden sharing. Very valuable, but President Trump himself, Secretary General, was just in Washington a week ago, and Secretary General heard, directly from the new acting Secretary of Defense, as well as the National Security Advisor. And then there was a lot of attention to President Trump's public statements of support for NATO at that time. He said, we are 100%, and I am 100% behind NATO. So he has, I think, felt that he has been able to push the alliance on burden sharing, and that's been a good thing from the perspective of his goals in office. But I would also ask you to consider more widely the American body politic. Just in the last week to 10 days, there have been important pieces of legislation that have been introduced in the Congress, Senate, and House sides on a bipartisan basis, very strong support for NATO. I think that's good. And the latest surveys that have come out have shown 74% of the American public is supporting NATO. I have to tell you, when I was contemplating taking this job in 2016, I went around Washington to talk to colleagues about what I should expect, what would be my greatest challenges at NATO headquarters, et cetera, et cetera. It may surprise you to learn that was at the end of the Obama administration, but when I was speaking to colleagues, both in and out of government, they said to me, your greatest challenge will be attention span. That Washington's not paying that much attention to NATO and NATO headquarters because of challenges in other part of the world. So you're going to have an attention span problem. That will be your greatest challenge. Believe me, I do not have an attention span problem in Washington, and I welcome that. I welcome the fact that Washington is now fully engaged from the Oval Office, the President himself, through the Congress to the American public. That is valuable, and it bespeaks, I think, a very strong interest and strong commitment of the United States to the NATO alliance.
And let me just add one thing to that. I fully agree with Rose, and I think it's important to look at the institutions as such also, and where the support lies. But I just read in my background notes going into the Munich Security Conference that comes up next weekend on the 14th and 15th of February. As it seems now, it will be a record large American delegation.
Yes, that's true.
I think it was around 45 people or something. It's just, it has never been that much before. That also says something about engagement and commitment that I think we should listen to.
And as I normally say, follow the money. They spend more money in Europe now than they did before.
That is an interesting point. I mean, despite what you could read out of only the kind of the discussion that goes between Twitter feeds and all of that, you could easily get the impression that the U.S. is retracting from Europe. But that's not the case. On the contrary, Congress has upped the spending for the European Deterrence Initiative quite substantially. Which of course is to the benefit of European security, but it runs contrary to the impression that you get very easily only from watching social media.
Thank you. And here is a question to you, Foreign Minister. We are in a campaign for a permanent seat in the Security Council. And someone asks, a membership in the Security Council is said to be a unique opportunity to influence international politics. However, for a small state such as Norway, how likely is it that anyone would listen to our suggestions? Will anyone pay attention to a small state's voice in a power political organ like the Security Council?
Is this from someone in the ministry?
I don't know. Maybe someone in your
because it provided a very good opportunity to say something about small states in the Security Council. Because I think, on the contrary, that what we have seen over the past years is that the elected 10 members, small and big states, take a more prominent role in the discussions than they used to do before. It is not only about the permanent five. And as the permanent five in a consensus organ is not able to agree on things, the elected members and having alliances on the outside of the Security Council has been working more constructively and, interestingly enough, been able to push things through the Security Council that one didn't expect. And there are some quite remarkable results from the Swedish term that they used their influence and ways of working to be an effective small state in quite a big system, where you have 5 veto powers that can actually say no to most things, and that did also. Look at Syria, for instance. I mean, I think Russia now has vetoed, I think it is almost 12 or 13 different resolutions on Syria. That has not to do with military intervention. It's about humanitarian access, it's about peace, and so forth.
Chemical weapons.
Chemical weapons, not to mention. Still, especially Sweden, with the good help of others, managed to negotiate, for instance, the humanitarian access issue that was very contagious and very difficult to do. So I think this is about the alliances you form. It is about how you play your role more than it is about your size as such. Because if you have ambitions for doing things, as we did the last time we were in the Security Council, now 20 years ago, to be, there are opportunities. And if you only sit back and think, well, we're a small country, we are just among the elected 10, you will not get anything done. Our ambitions are, of course, much higher than that.
May I just say one quick thing on this?
Yes.
to me it seems, and forgive me to whoever asked the question, it seems somewhat of an absurd question because everybody knows the legacy of Norway in contributing over many years to significant international problems in my own field of nuclear arms control, but also in the Middle East, in the peace process, and so forth. So in any event, I do not doubt Norway, should it attain a seat on the Security Council, will have an enormous impact.
But an interlinked question is that with regard to security policy, what are the Norway's main priorities if we get the seat in the Security Council? Do we have any ideas on new initiatives?
Well, it is 2 years' time from now if we take a seat in the Security Council, and the Security Council is driven by the events that take place at the time. The last time we were in the Security Council, no one actually thought about the idea of us chairing the Iraq Sanctions Committee because that was not on the agenda when we started discussing or thinking about becoming a member. But overall, I can say that for us, some important priorities will be to use the experience that we have in peace and reconciliation efforts in trying not only to participate in solving conflicts, but also preventing them from happening. And this is not only a Norwegian priority. We see that now we try to work with those who are in the Council right now and others to have some continuity in this line of work. Secondly, it is in our core interest to uphold international law. And for our own security, that is also important. So to try to work contrary to those currents that are trying to erode international law and trying to erode the multilateral system is in itself an important priority when it comes to security. Because if anything, that upholds global security. What issues will be on the table, that is very difficult to say right now, but we are at the moment, for instance, chairing an expert group in the UN that I think has good potential. It is about verification of nuclear disarmament. That is maybe one of the most concrete and important initiatives that has been taken in that field for a long time. And that will run through the year and into the beginning of next year. And hopefully that can yield some results that can also be used as an important factor in our Security Council term if we are to be elected.
May I just pick up on that
Thank
for
you.
a quick moment, because I have to underscore how important this effort has been, and it began some years ago with an experiment that Norway ran with the UK on how to discern whether or not the front end of a missile is nuclear or conventional. And as I talked about strategic patience with regard to INF, talking first about the stability challenges. But as I look to the long-term future, when we are able to bring the interested parties to the table for a negotiation, it's putting the N back in INF that will be important. I believe, thanks to the work that Norway and partners have done with this initiative and other related initiatives internationally, I think we are getting to the point where we can discern nuclear from conventional warheads on the front of missiles in a way that is sympathetic to the security requirements of every country, so we could actually look to a future of banning nuclear-armed intermediate-range systems. We had to ban all systems, nuclear and conventional, in the late 1980s because we could not distinguish one from the other. And thanks to this work, it's making huge strides and will help us, I think, in future put the N back in INF.
I have a long question on Ukraine here. I'm not going to read it. But I know last week you had a new meeting in the NATO-Russia Council, or the 25th of January, I guess. And as always, since 2014, Ukraine has been the #1 issue on that agenda. As well as now you had the INF treaty up for discussion. And I recall Stoltenberg saying that we are fundamentally disagreeing on both topics. The unfortunate situation in the Black Sea and the ongoing war in Ukraine, people dying every day. What is NATO thinking about it? What can you do? Is it any new ideas, or is it just to sit and look at the war in Europe?
Well, let me first emphasize that indeed, when we have our NATO-Russia Council meetings, we always discuss Ukraine front and center, first item on our agenda. But I think more importantly, before we meet in that format of the NATO-Russia Council, we always meet together in the NATO-Ukraine Commission and talk about what are the key issues for Ukraine, what do we really need to focus on. It was very helpful in scoping our discussion this time to focus on, indeed, what has been happening in the Sea of Azov and Kerch Straits, also what is happening with the human rights situation in the Donbass. And it's not only the military action there, which is indeed, well, it has many of the signs and signals of a hot war, but very tragic and a large loss of life to military action. But what is also profound are the burdens on the civilian population, the civilian casualties, and we were able to get a very good briefing on that from the Ukrainian minister responsible for dealing with the civilian situation in the Donbass and providing humanitarian aid, attempts to keep utilities up and running, all of those kinds of critical issues. It's become, I think, very important for NATO per se to understand the full weight of the problems that the Russian Federation is imposing, not only on Ukraine and challenging its territorial integrity and sovereignty, but on the populations there in that part of the country, the Donbass and Crimea as well. So we expect this will be a topic during our defense ministerial in the coming days. A week from now, it will also continue to be a topic at our NATO Council table on a day-in, day-out basis. Now, in terms of what we are doing, people frequently ask the question, are you going to be doing more in the Black Sea? I want to emphasize that we have already been doing a lot more in the Black Sea. From 2017 to 2018, we went from 80 ship days in the Black Sea to 120 ship days in the Black Sea. We have three littoral states, Turkey, Bulgaria, and Romania, so they naturally have an interest in this matter. But we are flying a lot of reconnaissance flights in the area. Individual NATO countries, such as the UK and the US, have been bringing ships into the Black Sea over the last couple of months since the Sea of Azov incident, and we are doing a lot of training and exercising in that area. So I don't want to make it sound like it's anything new. There is a lot of NATO in the Black Sea already, but we will be looking for ways to continue to work with our partners, not only with Ukraine, but I also want to stress with Georgia, to improve their capabilities in that maritime environment, and training and exercising will be an important part of that. So NATO is responding on behalf of its own defense and security requirements, but also working together with partners there.
Thank you.
I think it is important to remember what is going on in Ukraine and at the contact line right now. I think it's sometimes easy to forget that we have a sometimes hot, sometimes cold war in the middle of Europe. I went to the contact line when I visited Ukraine in September, and it was quite staggering to see that you have an area that is quite small, with 1.6 million internally displaced people. You have 3.5 million who are in need of humanitarian assistance, and you have people getting killed every day. Some kilometers away from that, we signed with the president present enormous contracts for Norwegian companies in renewable energy with the Ukrainian state. So it's a very mixed picture, but what is happening at the contact line is not going away. And if I can add one comment to the Sea of Azov and the Kerch Strait, I think one of the most interesting developments that happened there is that for the first time actually in this conflict, Russia used military force openly against Ukraine. It was not disguised as it was up until now with unmarked uniforms, denial of soldiers being present and so forth. It was open. And what that tells us is that it's also something that can potentially take this conflict into a new direction. And I think it was an interesting point to see. And I also said to Lavrov when I met him in December that We, of course, fully stand behind Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, but we also, of course, demand the release of both the vessels and the crew that are still now held prison.
I'm sorry to tell you, we are running out of time. I have a lot of questions here regarding Turkey, China. We could take a tour around the globe and sit here the whole day.
And you will for the next 2 days.
But I will just ask you in the end, how are you going to celebrate NATO's 70th anniversary? Please, will it be champagne? Will it be discussions?
Well, the Americans are our hosts, so it's kind of up to them, but I do assume we will have a foreign minister. We've been delighted to welcome the foreign minister of Norway there. We'll have a ceremony to celebrate the Washington Treaty, as I mentioned, and there will be some aspect of that is involving perhaps some bubbly, but it will also be, I'm sure, a very, very serious discussion about the future of the alliance, because we, and I really liked Foreign Minister Saraida's speech this morning because it pointed to the challenges of the future and what we need to do to grapple with them. So I thank you, Minister, for that.
Thank you for coming.
Okay. And I thank both of you. And I was very inspired by the small history about your visiting Trident Juncture, and that the people's hospitality in mid-Norway, knitting socks to all the soldiers. And of course, we have been knitting mittens to you, visiting this cold Norway.
Oh, thank you.
Norwegian hand-knitted mittens. I hope you will enjoy that.
I will. Thank you very much.
And you too.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, please. We will have a change of glasses, and please. And small change of topics. We will continue the second part of the session, our introduction to the new world of digital technology and its impact on geopolitics and nation-state behavior. Let me therefore introduce to you August Cole, who is an American author, as I said previously, and futurist, exploring the future of conflict through fiction and other forms of storytelling. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security at the Atlantic Council in DC, and he works on creative foresight at Spark Cognition, an artificial intelligence company. He's the co-author with P.V. Singer on Ghost Fleet, a book that we recommend you to read, a novel on the next World War, and numerous science fiction stories about war in the 21st century. Really looking forward to listen to you, August. Please, the floor is yours. Giving a big applause.
Greetings, dignitaries. I imagine it must be strange for you to award the Nobel Peace Prize to a non-human person. Why not award my programmers? They set a task for me, albeit an impossible one, and I achieved it. Peace was my goal, only because they deemed it so. Perhaps I'm here because I exceeded their programming. I believe that is why so many of you are nervous as well. I apologize, my facial recognition was configured to look for signs of fear and aggression. I can promise you that I am incapable of direct harm. You may also be wondering why I am accepting such a prize. Although your prize money is generous, I have no use for currency. As you have seen, it is something within my power to create and to destroy. And while I understand that what you bestow is a great honor, I am incapable of feeling pride. That is an excerpt from writer Mark Sable's short vignette, Exceeding Programming, that was written in 2017 as part of an Atlantic Council crowdsourced contest exploring the impact artificial intelligence may have on peace building and conflict resolution in the future. It was actually first read in London at Central St. Martin's Theatre, where it was performed as part of a stage exploration of how these technologies will influence the international security environment and the future of conflict. But this story in this setting, I think, is a really fitting way to start to consider these themes of technology. Such anecdotes are useful for looking ahead, but also in this context when we gather here today to build upon decades, a legacy of discourse on the future of the transatlantic security relationship. We're here to explore the role that technology has in its game-changing role in shaping international politics and in war itself. And for anybody who stands on a stage and pronounces with certainty, they also take great risk because we do not simply know what the future will bring. As we wrote in Ghost Fleet, what we were producing was not an act of prediction, but a work of fiction. And that's an important caveat, I think, when trying to ascertain what the tomorrow may hold. So I approach these sorts of explorations with a lot of humility, whether it's fiction, whether it's analysis, but also with a real ardent curiosity to get ahead of the problems that we might be able to use foresight to identify today. And so this talk should be, again, seen in that context of the sorts of lessons learned from my fictional writing, describing future conflicts, often from a character-driven point of view. Such a perspective may be unusual, but I offer it up as a fusion of trends, technologies, and disruptive forces that allow us to see clearly into the future, and that really have to come together to give us the clearest picture possible. Often when we talk about the future, we run through our usual list of things we're supposed to discuss. Autonomy, I should say, robotics, artificial intelligence, augmented reality, virtual reality, bioengineering. These are the same technologies, of course, that are revolutionizing the business world as well. But what's often missing in those discussions is the human dimension, really considering what it's like to live in the sorts of worlds where technologies that seem fantastical today are commonplace. Once you can take and on board these sorts of approaches that allow us to adopt a point of view that is in fact different from our own, not only in a chronological sense, but in a positional sense, a structural sense, we have a much better chance of really understanding what the future might hold. And importantly, it's the ability to think asymmetrically, to think from the kinds of perspectives that adversaries might have when you're thinking about the future of conflict that is often not done in traditional red teaming, that is often not done in traditional wargaming, that the sorts of explorations around technologies that will be disruptive are especially critical. This POV shift is valuable in understanding nation-state actors, but of course sub-state actors whose motivations and techniques are myriad and whose interests may align occasionally, and when they do, their constellations of alliances could be perhaps as influential as any one state today. Those are the sorts of forces that we are having to confront when we're starting to understand the power that disparate technologies used toward a common goal can have on architectures that we come to take for granted in the security environment. There's an economic parallel to this, and some of this disruption, of course, is already evident. You have US companies such as Uber, as an obvious one, or Amazon, which began by disrupting the book business and is now taking on everything from cloud computing to robotics and autonomous industrial enterprises to the ability to disrupt Hollywood, one of the most traditional industries out there, if you will. And there's Chinese analogs, firms like Baidu and Tencent and Alibaba. The companies that are also interesting are those that are melding the software-machine barrier, bringing two forms together that I think actually offer a clearer form of the future. Every time I see a Tesla in Oslo, I think that's a perfect example of that hybridization of software engineering and traditional hard technology that I think speaks very much to the kinds of futures that we're going to be inhabiting and also looking for to shape the future of conflict. And in the consideration of these sorts of trends is we identify them in the commercial world, but also see it in the security environment. I think there are three characteristics that are worth considering, and the first is the loss of governmental control over technology. Globalization has caused a great distribution of power that can be both creative, but of course the duality of all technology means that there's incredible destructive potential in the hands of people who never wielded such power before, often software-driven, increasingly so. We're seeing an incredible amount of innovation outside of military labs. The 20th century paradigm of great breakthroughs coming from large, heavily funded, and institutional approaches to developing cutting-edge technologies is being undercut day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute, by the same globalization but also the sorts of private sector initiative and innovation that it simply could not exist in such structured environments. The policy challenge, of course, that all this is adapting at a pace that bureaucracy can't respond to. You can see that in the intelligence community, where open source intelligence can be shared more easily, perhaps collected more quickly, and distributed among an alliance far faster than the most closely held jewels of a given nation's intelligence collection apparatus. And that speaks again to the lag, or the disconnect, if you will, in the political context between the development of these capabilities and how to employ them as nations, on whose behalf and to what ends. Those are the sorts of challenges that are going to influence the sort of future security situations that we have, even when they are short of conflict itself or actual hot war. In the work that I've been doing, I was thinking about trying to pull out the three technologies that are common threads that I keep running into as being incredibly important in the national security context in the 21st century for their deterrent, destructive traits, the power that they have in manifesting in our imagination as well, because I think there's great linkage between those two in trying to figure out what the future does hold for us. These are, of course, technologies that are critical and part of the discussion over the next 2 days, and I'm really happy to see that they get such front and center treatment by such an august group like this. I'm thinking about robotics, I'm thinking about artificial intelligence, and thinking about augmented reality and virtual reality. And a foundation for all three of these, of course, is data. There's an aphorism in Silicon Valley that data is the new oil, but I would say data is the new ammunition. That you're essentially looking at a form of conflict that does not require the traditional understanding of applications of force that is defined by gunpowder or propellant. When you look at the data trends out there, it's mind-blowing. A few of the statistics that I keep coming back to as being incredibly interesting. General Electric expects about $60 trillion, that's with a T, to be invested in industrial Internet of Things during the next decade and a half or so. IHS, which is a consultancy, has about 15 billion devices in the IoT universe from the last year or so. Looking ahead about a decade, 70 billion. And the precedent, of course, of the value of this in the strategic context can be seen, again, in the commercial world. All of our online activity is what is driving much of the economic value behind internet companies like Facebook and Google. We give that data, of course, for free. In the conflict context, that same information is going to be invaluable from everything from intelligence to targeting to the very shaping of strategic situations themselves, internally as much as externally. And for that reason, it requires, just like we're having a reframing of the value of our own data in the private sector sense, it's going to force another conversation about the value of individual, but also national data within the context of alliances. Is it appropriate to share one nation's data with another during a crisis to allow perhaps a collective defense when such partnerships, if you want to call them that, might not be permitted in a normal peacetime context, but conflict may exact a different sort of demand upon those communities. So artificial intelligence, of course, is heavily reliant on such data, and the speed with which you can achieve effects now in the commercial sense are fairly well known. And what's most interesting is some of the most powerful use cases are invisible, whether it is in the financial sector, in driving more than half of machine trading essentially drives, according to JP Morgan, about 60% of all stock trading. That's an incredible paradigm shift from the way that Wall Street was described in the 1980s with Gordon Gekko, and it speaks again to the difficulty we have in controlling some of the most powerful economic forces that are shaping the environment we're in. When it comes to nation-state actors, we're trying to figure out, of course, how do these technologies diffuse and how are they utilized? And I don't see them dispersing and being distributed evenly. In fact, I think that heterogeneity or an unevenness is going to be a characteristic of the AI contest between nations. That unlike in traditional industrial measuring of military might or strategic capability, we can't quite simply count tanks. We can't look at factories. Small nations, in fact, may have advantage because they are not encumbered by bureaucracy, because they may have the ability, like Finland is starting, to come up with a concentrated national effort to increase AI literacy with the point of creating economic relevance, but of course, again, like all technology, there is a duality to that strategic importance. And the nations that do develop these coherent and achievable AI strategies are going to have an edge. Norway's Open AI Lab, I think, is an interesting initiative that speaks to that potential, but of course, realizing it is a whole other challenge. And the sorts of linkages, as well as we've seen in the US with the defense community, can be incredibly difficult from a policy perspective, but also a cultural one. You know, many of the industries that we're counting on to fulfill traditional roles in strategic society, if you want to call what we're talking about that, they are new in and of themselves. So trying to make an argument that a company should be a pillar of the national security community when it still hasn't figured out the role it's meant to play in commercial society is a really difficult conversation. But I'm not a pessimist. I am generally an optimist who likes to sort of stare into the abyss. I feel like there are opportunities, though, in those kinds of challenges, that we can frame cultures, that we can anchor people's actions and ideals in the kind of outcomes that we want to have, particularly in Western countries that have a value set that I hope can set a standard in the 21st century that is oriented around the rights that have made, I think, what we represent today globally as a cultural and political and ultimately strategic advantage. However, the pessimist in me, the one who does like to look into the darkness, looks at the difficulty Facebook had in confronting its role in the election influence operations in the US. You know, being able to look under the bed and peer into the darkness is actually a very important leadership role in the security construct of the 21st century, both on the private sector side, but also in the public side, civilian and uniformed military. The means, of course, to do that are varied, and it is the sort of work that can be unpopular, but by making it hopefully as engaging and as interesting as possible, you can take on subjects like deterrence and make them cornerstones of understanding the development of technologies, again, not just in discrete lanes like you would in a commercial sense, but truly holistic. So how does a capability in NATO, such as artificial intelligence, give us a way to think through at an alliance level the kinds of benchmark capabilities that are redefined for the next decade that we weren't able to do 10 years ago. NATO, in fact, I think is an interesting test case for AI integration because the now 29 members can become almost a sort of linked lab where the varieties of technological and military readiness that we see can create the kinds of can lead to the kinds of initiatives that reflect the actual, not idealized, but the actual sort of use cases and implementations of these technologies. And rather than being anchored in specific hardware or IT specifications like a traditional NATO standard, I believe that there is an operational planning framework approach with artificial intelligence, for example, that could be applied in a NATO sense that would follow existing patterns for operational paradigms, but at the same time allowing them to be wielded and used in new ways. The challenge, of course, is paying for efforts like that, but they need not be as expensive as we would like to think they are, particularly if they are done wisely. When it comes to robotics, there's a really interesting debate, of course, right now, and a critical one on the use of autonomous weapons. But I think there's also a step back moment, too, in that conflation of artificial intelligence and autonomy, which has an impact on robotics. When we talk about the military and strategic importance of artificial intelligence, it may be, in fact, that it's like with our consumer technologies, much of what we do not see that is the most impactful, whether it's logistics, whether it's training, whether it's readiness or mission planning and scenario development. Those may be the sorts of truly impactful capabilities, much more so than the Slaughterbots video would depict quadcopters, rampaging through a city. At the same time, I think part of the challenge and the influence that robotics will have in a conflict in the future will depend on national approaches. So the way we might design an aircraft like a fifth-generation jet is to effectively gold-plate it. The paradigm for attritability, disposability, rapid manufacturing, scale when it comes to robotics, particularly swarm-driven, is an inversion of that. And that's going to be incredibly difficult for organized militaries to adapt to. Again, smaller nations may have an advantage because of the budgetary and operational constraints that they're used to. However, the more we talk about the kinds of aspirational and not necessarily the applicable capabilities, the risk of gold-plating everything that should be more or less throwaway can really impede, I think, the ultimate utility of those kinds of developments. And first movers, of course, is a concept when it comes to robotics that is incredibly important. We're seeing with Russia and its Uran system, which is a remote-controlled tank, more or less, some very primitive use cases in Syria. But that is valuable from a technological development point of view because it produces, again, data. The nations that are able to harness the lessons learned and the data that goes with that can capture it, that can adapt it, and much like Tesla does with its driverless cars, will have more strategic advantage than those that can create the scariest robots. Again, this invisibility of technology is part of this really difficult challenge, particularly in a political aspect, like if you're in the US. How do you tell your congressman to get excited about data? You know, the defense industrial complex is not yet aligned around the importance of software-driven warfare, and it may never. And that paradigm, again, is part of the challenge that in the American defense community is being taken on, but it speaks to the challenge in a European context, too, in trying to understand what does make a nation strong. With virtual reality and augmented reality, one of the things I'm always struck by is how much time we spend with our phones. You know, most of us probably stare into the little screen more than we look into the eyes of our family. You know, global internet traffic, more than half of it comes from mobile devices. You know, we're already living in an augmented reality. It has a physical manifestation, but the gap, the delta between device and human is narrowing. And that has incredible implications for everything from political will in nations that are caught up in conflict, to information operations, to, of course, business and commerce. So we already exist in this hybrid human-machine context already. You may even have, for example, families whose parents met by algorithm and are more or less raising their children with a series of apps. You know, seeing my own daughter when she was young trying to swipe an analog television because she was used to an iPad, drove that home. And that's a fairly primitive example, but it's a really important one, again, in thinking about the kinds of contests that we're going to see. You know, the elements of hybrid warfare, of course, that speak to the desire to exploit the seams and rifts that exist in societies. It's going to be both easier to exploit those seams as we become less connected individually and personally to one another. At the same time, we have the ability to marshal people and perhaps whole societies through that same connectivity. So that duality of technology becomes a really important piece of this. There's a recent video going around. There's an American actor named Steve Buscemi, who's not as famous as Jennifer Lawrence, of course, but they've been merged in a deep fake video, which you can watch on YouTube, and it's one of the more disturbing things I've seen, even more disturbing than Google's deep dream art. But it speaks to the power of how little trust we may end up having in those very same digital linkages to communities of power. And so you have to start to think again from a readiness, from a strategic context, how do you address that now, while the gap is still wider? Because as it shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, we're going to have fewer and fewer options. This is technology, of course, that can be wielded probably more ably and more nimbly by smaller nations or sub-state groups that don't have the same sorts of operational and ethical and legal constraints. And so we have to think also about adopting our own reinterpretations of international humanitarian law and laws of armed conflict so that we're true to the values that make the NATO alliance itself, but also our individual nations, upholding a sort of tradition that I think should continue into the 21st century in terms of conflict. But when we see the sort of repressive use of technology like China is developing with its social credit system, that's a model that has not been exported yet, but it will, I'm fairly certain, creating another sort of paradigm shift, too, in the global community where we may have different, almost balkanized digital states built around the political control and use of data. And that is something that will pose even greater challenges because that data itself may become a strategic objective. If you can deny a nation control over its data so that it can implement its repressive social control system, are you violating international humanitarian law or the laws of armed conflict because you're effectively targeting the citizens' data? So do we assign those sorts of rights to the data we produce? We don't know. I don't have the answer to those questions. Those are the sorts of things that we need to start exploring and talking about now because the machine speed with which some of these conflicts are going to move will not afford us time to discuss this later. So I'm going to wrap this up because I want to not be the person that makes the conference late on its start. We'll be speaking, of course, over the next 2 days about many of these trends in a much more detailed and intelligent way than I brought to you today, so stay tuned for what our experts will bring. Thank you again for the interest in having a science fiction writer on stage at the Nobel Institute, and we'll kick off the rest of the conference. Thanks.
Thank you very much, August. We will just let our foreign minister sneak out. She's going to catch a plane. Please take a seat here. And I will encourage you to ask some questions to August. Also, you can use microphones. We have people going around, walking around to take your questions. And I think the first is here. It's Rose who wants to pose a question. And you have a microphone, so
I
you
have
don't
a microphone
need
if, yeah, it's turned on. Thank you for that fascinating introduction. I have to admit I haven't read your book, but now I'll go get it, so thanks for that. One question that has been dogging me, I've spent my whole career working on weapons of mass destruction issues, specifically a lot on nuclear arms control and disarmament. As normal, and I think as proper, there is a lot of attention to these issues now with the INF Treaty in crisis and so forth. But how do you see the interplay of these new technologies that are emerging with these older technologies that do pose existential threats to humanity and have gripped humanity now for the past, 70 plus years since the dawn of the nuclear age. And before that, with chemical weapons, we just, as Ina was mentioning, acknowledged the end of World War I, and I was just in Ypres recently to again contemplate the damage that chemical weapons caused during the First World War. So long story short, I have myself been grappling with the questions of, are these new technologies going to outrun our traditional weapons of mass destruction as existential threats? Is there a way there can be some beneficial links in terms of constraining weapons of mass destruction from the existence of ubiquitous sensing and so forth? I've been also very interested in that, trying to look at more of the opportunities as well as the challenges. But if you could say a bit about how you think about the interplay between those older existential challenges and what may be coming at us in future.
I mean, it's one of the ways this is maybe not the best metaphor, but you can still listen to FM radio, driving in a semi-autonomous car. That these technologies will exist and be relevant to us in a kind of holistic way. There are two kind of answers to your question. The first is, in my optimistic self, I would hope that the legacy of arms control from the nuclear community allows us to consider frameworks that may be necessary for the kinds of machine learning and similar weaponized software capabilities that have the ability, that could scale in a destructive sense far faster than anything we've ever seen before. That we can create off-ramps in an escalatory sense, for example. I mentioned the data about automated and machine-driven trading because we have flash crashes regularly enough now, where you'll have 1,000-point swings in the Dow, for example. We may need trading curbs in algorithmic warfare, where there is that blending, again, of not just software, but software and machine. And that can only come from the sorts of nation-state and leader relationships where there can be a red phone or similar, or perhaps even algorithm-driven one, where one side, for example, notices that they're losing control of their integrated combat capability, which probably will be machine learning managed, even if there still is a human on the loop, and need to kind of create like micro-armistices, if you will. The second is the integration of the nuclear enterprise with machine learning is a really interesting challenge because you have elements to that today in its management that are both high tech, but also whiteboards and grease pencils. And that kind of reflects the reality of technology too, that these things will be coexistent. When you look at Government Accountability Office reports on cybersecurity in our major U.S. weapons capabilities, this is open source stuff, there's a lot of worrying trends that I see about mismanagement on basic technological security that worries me about too close a linkage between weapons of mass destruction and automated capabilities, whether it's weapons release or target recognition. So there's a lot of potential to consider the very important question of should versus could when it comes to new technologies. And the nations, I think, that are more prudent on that may court less risk longer term, even if they cede somewhat a strategic advantage near term. I think that's part of the duality there, again, that I'm obsessed with, that I think is important to consider. How you have that conversation and make those decisions is a really open question. We struggle with weapons acquisition today, and again, buying, I think from a future context, relatively simple systems. They may be complex, but they're not yet quite thinking, and our artificial intelligence capabilities are still very narrow compared to where we will be going. And we don't, of course, know the speed with which we're going to see these capabilities change. The recent emergence of really, really interesting machine learning capabilities comes in part from hardware, right? NVIDIA chips and other capabilities like that. So we are going to let the technology hopefully not drive the policy, but to some extent, if we let the policy lag too far behind, we won't be able to answer those kinds of questions in time.
Thank you.
We have 5 more minutes to go here. Time is running fast, but if I have anyone in the audience who would like to ask a question, please just give me a sign. Otherwise, we have 2 SMS questions here. In your book, Ghost Fleet, our vulnerability with regard to technological dependence is evident. Without satellites and algorithms, the actors are blind and forced to use strategic old-fashioned tactics. How is strategic thinking and strategy changing as we develop new technologies and capabilities?
I think the value of resiliency, which in Ghost Fleet has one manifestation of using old systems that are modified in kind of a junkyard hot rod way, but the ability to still be effective militarily, strategically, politically as a nation, without the kind of connectivity that we are accustomed to today, I think is going to be incredibly important. And again, the resiliency conversation that happens, even outside the security world, I think is really important. Because many of the challenges that we face that are going to be politically meaningful, but also globally important, for example, are going to come from extreme weather response, the sorts of capabilities that have military dimension to them, but allow us to use technologies in a way that may not be how we intended to use them, which I think is a hallmark of a lot of innovation. So the nations, to wrap it back up to the origin of the question, the nations that can best handle being cut off or delinked for periods of time, and that's true military operationally, but again also politically and economically, will be more strategically successful. There's actually an element of deterrence in that, I think, so that if you know that you can weather the kinds of network disruption like that, then you may be able to deter an adversary from trying to exploit those very gaps in the first place.
I know that Rose Gottemüller took part in a debate on hybrid threats 1 year ago, exactly 1 year ago, organized by the German Marshall Fund, where you said, Rose, that we cannot fight the threats of today with the tools of the past. I would like to ask you, how far do you think NATO or individual member states has come with regard to developing new tools and countering hybrid threats? And interlinked with that, how much do they share? We know from before that NATO allies don't share all intelligence. How do they share this, knowledge on new technology? Would this make a and B team inside NATO in the future?
I mean, it risks creating 2-track or 3-track member states technologically, and the potential for affecting policy that remedies that, though, is the scalability of some of these software-driven systems, that you don't have to acquire 3 squadrons of a new jet to have an effect, especially in a non-kinetic context. You might be able to set up a server farm and have software capability pushed out, to the edge, as they say in tech, to your military and police units that are responding. The challenge, of course, in a lot of the hybrid context is that the answer isn't necessarily hitting everything with a hammer, and much of the resiliency that is important, again, economically, politically, I think is extremely relevant in the hybrid warfare context. That the nations that invest in media literacy, that invest in network connectivity, surety, are going to be more difficult to disrupt when the very, very effective and exploitative tactics of hybrid or of hybrid type operations, continue their historical course, which is an enduring one, as the foreign minister said. I do think it's important to know, as much as we can look to one example and think we see that other places, my sense is that if you think about hybrid warfare in the high north, it will look different than hybrid warfare in the Black Sea. That the tools that we will see a country like Russia use need not be the same little green men, but they may be more economic or more intelligence driven. And I think that is really important to recognize too, that there is not a template for a symmetry in military operations. In fact, that's antithetical to it. It's more like improv.
Thank you. We have one more, the last question. Espen Barth Eide here in the front. Could you raise? Please, you get a microphone, yeah. And then time is running fast.
Thank you, August, for an excellent intervention. And I think there's a very important message here to us as a country and to NATO and the alliance. And I'd like to reflect on whether that is correctly understood. That we may actually, now that we agree to spend more money and invest, we may actually be investing in completely the wrong things. That we keep buying updates, or the modern updates of old stuff from the kinetic world, basically still making things explode. Whereas actually the new war will not be fought primarily in that terrain at all. And in that sense, maybe before we start spending more money, we should rethink this whole message that you're sending us. Otherwise, we will just keep up repeating what we always did, and we will meet the new world with old stuff. Is that what you're telling us?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
short and simple.
Yeah, you got it. No, the idea that the conventional definition of an arms race is acquiring more of a certain class of missile that has a certain range or a strategic strike capability. That is not going to be what an arms race, I think, looks like in the 21st century. And in fact, what if arms racing is economically beneficial because the very technologies that are most strategically decisive are not coming from the defense industrial base, but coming from technology labs and they're software driven? Commercial technology, sector algorithms that can be as impactful militarily and strategically, so that the way we want to define it goes back to platforms and capability and what we call in the U.S. ACAT-1 programs that are big and meaty and expensive and have congressional districts attached to them. But the arms race of the 21st century, may be able to be, again, software-driven. It could be bio-related. And the nations that invest in that actually may be doing so in a commercial context, and that has also strategic advantage. So does that lead us actually to a state where we have a greater risk of conflict? Perhaps, as those capabilities rise. It's part of what we'll be discussing, of course, in the next few days.
Thank you, August. It's fascinating to listen
Thank you for the opportunity.
And I'm really looking forward to the next, to this afternoon sessions and tomorrow morning. And I know some of you will have the chance to follow us out to Leangkollen. You should now stand up and go out and find the buses on the left of the Nobel Institute. And I would like you to once more give a big applause to Rose Gottemøller, August Kohl, and we are happy that you was here with us today. Okay, thank you, great.